Hi everyone, it's Nate and welcome back to Elevate with Nate, the place where we're all about learning, self-improvement and motivation, and where I discuss what new things I've learned in the last 24 hours, and I encourage you to share with us in the comment section what you've learned and how you've improved in the last 24 hours. So, in today's episode, I'm going to be talking about mobile app development. And although it's not something which I've learned just today, in the last 24 hours, I've actually done this for many years, it's something which I do every single day. So I thought it would be worth making a video on. So in this video, I'll be breaking down 3 types of mobile app development. There's one which is for making just Android apps, secondly, just iOS apps, and then lastly, multi-platform all-in-one. And I'm going to be mentioning the similarities and differences between these 3 different types. Now, before I start, you may be thinking, why don't you just use the all-in-one, do it half the time? And that's not a bad argument. I'll get into later on why you might not want to do that and when you might want to do that, but we'll get to that later. So, let's begin. And I want to start off with these things, what they are, what actually are they, and how are you going to yourself start this on your laptop? Because I understand that many of you watching this may have zero or very little experience with anything coding related, and I want to help you out to start. So let's start with the iOS, because that's probably the most kind of used thing in the West, let's say. Everyone has iPhones nowadays. So there's a app, let's say, to help you out here, which you can download on the App Store, on the store, called Xcode. And in Xcode, it's essentially where you're going to write all your code and create your iOS apps. So that's if you're doing the called native, just for iOS. Whereas the equivalent is called Android Studio, when you want to create your Android apps. So they're both things which you can download, okay? They're quite big files for your laptops, but you can download them. And then in there, what happens here is when you create your projects, it'll open it all up for you and create little pages. At that point, you can get started. And what's nice is it has in there 2 nice things. One is an inbuilt emulator. And in case you don't know what emulator means, it's essentially, let's say, an online like phone. Okay, so when you're doing the app, you can look on your screen, it shows you your mobile phone and what you've created on that phone. So you can use that and work through your code. You can also, if you want to, physically connect up your device to your laptop, or just do it by kind of Wi-Fi, I presume, to create it on your phone. And that I often do anyway, because I like to test it with my finger. But anyway, so you've got these 2 things, Xcode for the iOS and for doing Mac OS and tvOS and watchOS, and you have the Android Studio for your Android apps. And you go from there, and it's many nice things. It can auto fill in the code you're writing, it helps you out. But anyway, I'll leave all the coding stuff for a different video, but that's how you get started. And the point is, it's easy to get started. Download it, and off you go. Easy peasy. Whereas, for the all-in-one, I'm going to start with, in today's video, I'm discussing something called React Native, which is a multi-platform framework created by Facebook, actually. So yeah, that's Facebook. Android Studio was Google, and Xcode, of course, was Apple. Anyway, back to React Native. Here's a slight problem with React Native for what I call beginners, or very, very beginners. This isn't some app you can download from the App Store, like how you would with Xcode or Android Studio. This has to be downloaded essentially via the terminal. Now, if you don't know what terminal is, look it up, because I forget the exact definition. But essentially, when you think of, of coders in movies, you whip up the black screen with the writing on, they write all kind of code there. That's what terminal is. And on there, you have complete control over directories or your folders, downloading things, all done on the terminal of your laptop. So for example, just so you're aware, whereas someone with no experience might if you're downloading a video or photo online, you probably right click, save as, pick the folder. Now you can do that all directly via some lines of code from a terminal, and all software engineers will know this. But for people who have no experience, that's a bit of a jump to get into it. And sure, if you're really that keen and you want to win, you want to succeed and do it, you can look into it, and it's not that hard, but it's definitely a potential first kind of stepping stone to get over to enter this and do this coding. And I'll put links in the description to the web pages describing how to do this, because they try and make it as clear as possible for people who aren't too confident in using the terminal. But anyway, so the point was that for me, the slight downside of this for people trying to get into coding for the first time. Anyway, once you've done that, there's still one more step to do. You have to yourself now download a code editor to your laptop. And I use one called VS Code. There are many others. And it's basically where coders write their code. Okay, so say you're doing some Python or any other language, you're not going to rewrite it in the terminal for projects. You can use it, but you wouldn't for a project. So you've got a this is an actual app to download, and on there you can put in all your code, and this will look very similar to Xcode and to Android Studio. Anyway, so once you're on there, you will have created the whole app via the terminal, so for the project, and then you go from there. So at that point, you're now pretty similar for the two things. So it's harder to use React Native initially, but now you're on there, you're in the same place. But here's the benefit of React Native. Remember, that is the multi-platform one. With the multi-platform React Native, when you're testing your code on the emulator, it can there live, once you've got the app running on your emulator or your real device, and you change the actual code, it updates what's on the emulator. And someone who hasn't used this before, this might not sound like much, but I'll tell you why it's so fantastic. When you're using Android Studio or Xcode, the other ones, and you want to test this on an emulator, you have to actually run it. You have to download the file and load it. And it might take 20 seconds, if not more sometimes. At that point, you might test it and you go, it's the wrong color. Let's change that. Or sorry, I don't like this, let's change it. You have to then change the code, it might take you 1 second, and then also once again, re-download it might take 20 seconds, and that can keep happening, and it's so tedious and wastes a lot of your time. Whereas with the React Native, that updates right there and then. So I'm coding, I don't like that, let's try this instead. Oh, brilliant, I like that now. That's a better color, or whatever. So that's a humongous plus for React Native. So to summarize here, the positive for Android Studio and Xcode is that it can right there and then start a project, you download it, and it's easy peasy. Whereas React Native, you've got to understand how to use a terminal to get the project going, which can be a sticking point for people who are new to coding. But once you get going, it's actually nicer using React Native because it saves you time on the emulators and updating things fresh right there and then. So let's now go on to the platforms, kind of how you're actually going to be downloading this. And it's a pretty quick one here, but essentially React Native and Android Studio can be downloaded on basically anything, on Windows devices, on Macs, on Linux. That's all completely fine. The problem here is Xcode. Xcode being an Apple product does the classic, can only be downloaded on a Apple product. So you've got to have a MacBook to use Xcode. Or at least that's from my knowledge currently. If I made a mistake, then please someone correct me. But I'm pretty certain you've got to have a MacBook to use Xcode. This can be frustrating to people who haven't got that. So just bear that in mind. So let's go on to now another important thing, which is languages. And I don't mean human languages like Spanish and French. We're talking coding languages, Python, Java, etc. So you might be thinking, okay, well, surely they can all use the same thing. No, that's not how it works here. In many of these let's say these coding infrastructures, they all use different languages. And it's just like that for this. All three of the ones I've mentioned so far, Android Studio, Xcode, and React Native, they all use different coding languages. So just a very quick breakdown. Again, I don't want to right now go through every single pro and con of each language, but Xcode will use Swift, used to use Objective-C. Android Studio uses Java or Kotlin, and React Native will use React, but essentially JavaScript or TypeScript and JSX. And it's very similar to HTML and CSS, which is essentially what you use for creating web pages. So for someone who does that web page stuff, just so you're aware, React Native is very similar. So that's up your street. So which one is, for those people who are more new to this, you probably want to take the easier route to get started. And well, just immediately, Swift is very, very easy, okay? It's been made specifically by the people at Apple to make it easy for people to get into this and really get going, okay? Whereas for Android, okay, Android Studio, Java is not particularly easy, okay? That's a much harder one. You've got to write a lot of lines of code, often for the simple tasks, whereas Swift doesn't do that. And Kotlin's very similar. I think it's a lot more succinct, more like Swift. The rationale why I personally, when I started doing Android Studio, I did Java, and the rationale being was before there was ChatGPT, if you were stuck on a problem, you'd want to search online on forums for help, or if someone's seen that before and how they fixed it. And there's a website called Stack Overflow. It's still there, of course. And that was the main place to look. But when I first got into Android Studio and Android development, Kotlin the language was still quite new. And therefore I was aware that if I was going to get stuck, there's a good chance that I wouldn't find the help online. And I couldn't risk that for my big projects. So I went for Java, which was a harder one. And I'm pleased I did it, because it's always good to know these languages, especially kind of the lower level, let's say. But for someone who wants to just get into this quickly and get going, no, I'll recommend now start with Kotlin. It's got a bigger community and it's all fine now. Swift's great, Kotlin, and again, React Native with JavaScript and that stuff. I always say it's quite different, okay, to Swift and Kotlin or even Java. It's got a different vibe to it. It's a slightly different structure. So, but let's say if that was your first language to pick up, it's not any harder, I would say. It's just different, okay? So I wouldn't worry too much. Again, it's a lot more similar to the code you use for making web pages. So that is going to be the languages. So at that point, I want to kind of bring back in a conclusion to one of the first things that I mentioned, which was, well, why would anyone not go for the all-in-one multi-platform super duper amazing thing? Saves you half the time. And here it is, right? Think about anything in life. If you're focused, if you're a specialist in one field, the chances are you're going to be a lot better at that than someone that's focused on two things. And it's just like that for React Native compared to the other two the app development systems. For 90% of applications you want to make, let's say you want to make a little restaurant app on how to, or say Deliveroo, taking orders, so that's not too complex. You're probably completely fine using React Native. And actually a lot of these apps out there, which you use on a daily basis, do use React Native, okay? Or at least Flutter, a similar one. They do it because they don't require some amazing super duper app made by Xcode or by Android Studio. And on top of that, on a separate thing, if you look at now jobs online, most of these jobs for app developers want React Native and not the native individual ones, because they want a fast cycle of creating apps and updating them, and that's fantastic for all-in-one multi-platform React Native. So you may ask, okay, in what scenarios would I not want to use it then? And I'll give you a few examples where you want to have the specific of iOS and Android. And you can probably guess, it's ones where it's a pretty complex app. So here are some examples. Some complex video games which have high frame rates and live physics calculations being made in it. Let's say a Fortnite, you've got some characters shooting around, flying in. That's a pretty complex thing to have on your phone as an app. So chances are, if you want the best of all time for your app, you'll do it individually to maximize it, as opposed to using this all-in-one. Other things might be, if you want to have an app which will do live streaming, video editing, that's quite complex. If you've got an app which, let's say, can imagine like these apps where you're running along, it takes your heart rate and bits and bobs, that's pretty complicated. How about ones, let's say, imagine like a crypto website like Binance, which is constantly doing buy, sell, buy, sell, buy, sell. That needs to be, with the markets, pretty spot on. So all those massive ones will be using the individuals, the Xcode and the Android. But as I said, most of these ones I mentioned to you are all going to be massive companies out there, which can therefore afford to have a separate Android team and an iOS team, so that they're sorted. But if you are say you're an individual person who wants to make their own app to go viral, or you're a small company who hasn't got the funds, unless you're actually making this kind of app, go React Native, and it will be, it'll be plenty good for what you want to do. So that's my advice on this thing. If you're an average person, or say someone who wants to create, an app which hasn't got anything too crazy going on, then go with React Native. And the good thing there is you want to do the app and then go, oh, brilliant, I can now get it done quickly and dish it out to the entire world. Anyone using Android, anyone in iOS, I think even websites too. So that's my advice on it. And very finally, to anyone who wants to ask, okay, I'm got little to no experience in coding, should I start? Is it really hard? Is it a hard road to go down? I would say definitely start. And for a handful of reasons. Firstly, I think it's very rewarding and very fun to do anyway. Secondly, hey, in this world, what if you made an app which suddenly resonated with people and it went viral, and you've now got you're the new Mark Zuckerberg, the new Facebook creator. That's one reason. But also this, because of ChatGPT now, you've just got an infinite amount of help. You can, in some ways, get most of the code written for you. You set up your Android Studio, do this. Oh, I've got stuck. ChatGPT, how do I do this? Oh, here we go. Bam, copy and paste. You're sorted. It's a lot easier nowadays to do the code. And then a simple tip for you on how I recommend you start to learn, like at the very beginning, if you're a complete amateur. I always say, look, just go online, go onto YouTube and find a video. There are loads out there which will have a 4-hour tutorial on how to make this entire app from scratch. And they will themselves there be doing it all for you on the screen. All you do is, it'll take you double the time, but just pause it every 10 seconds and just, when they do a line, you do a line. When they do open the tab, you open the tab, and do exactly what they do. And by doing that, you'll get a feel for what works, how to use it, without making errors. Because the biggest thing which will hold you back when creating these apps is, for app creation or any kind of coding, it needs to be spot on. If the code is wrong, it will just not work. And on top of that, one of the hardest things initially for people learning to code is debugging it. It is not normally obvious where you've gone wrong. It will break and that's it. And you might get a few lines of code going, blah, 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 blah. Not in nice English. It'll be like some nasty kind of code language. And unless you know what you're doing and understand code, you're going to go, wait, sorry, what? What's gone wrong? And that's it. And then you're going to make it worse and make it worse. So if you initially start by watching these videos and do it word for word, you can get confidence, see how things work, and not just get stuck immediately. Once you've done that, then you can then go on to making easy projects and extend from there. But I recommend you start by copying other professionals online. And just remember, in case you're someone saying, oh, but I'm not good at maths, I can't do that, that sounds far too hard. It isn't actually that too tricky. Of course, I'll caveat that with, it depends on what your project is. If you're making some really kind of maths-based project, it will be hard, or harder. But for most people making an unusual app, and more kind of showing pictures, showing this, different screens, scrollables, that is just simply, well, you just go online and say, how do I create a scrollable view? And there's the answer. It's easy as that, and it's just follow the instructions. The logic, of course, other things gets harder, but it depends how hard you're making your app. And just remember, the main key skills I would say to be a good coder is methodical. You must be methodical in the way how your brain works. You must go through each line, time at a time, especially when you're debugging. Secondly, attention to detail. That will help you debug, but also get things right the first time around. And finally, patience. It might be different now with ChatGPT, but definitely when I started without chat out there to help, there are times where you spend an hour stuck, 2 hours stuck, a day stuck, even a week stuck on something. And you must have that patience and resilience to kind of go, okay, take a deep breath, let's try something different. Let's take time off from the app, let's get back into it, let's try a different approach. And I found personally that I've always ended up resolving it. But you've got to have that patience. If you keep pulling your hair out, then you're going to just get super frustrated, you're just going to give up. Okay, so you've got to have patience. And at that point, that's it, I think. Just give it a shot. So, that's all from me today on these mobile app developments. Hopefully you enjoyed that and now have a better idea on what it is, how to get started. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments and let me know what you want to hear more from in the next episode. Whether you want to hear an actual demo on how to actually physically start these different apps, these Xcode, the Android Studio, etc. And as ever, let me know what you've learned in the last 24 hours. What have you done to improve on your life? So that's all from me. If you enjoyed it, give it a like, give it a comment, subscribe if you haven't already. It's Nate. It's been great. Onwards and upwards.